Welcome, everyone. I'm very sorry I can't be with you and attend in person today. We at the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, AIGCC, are excited to be hosting today's energy transition event, which is very timely ahead of the Clean Energy Strategy draft that's due to be released this summer. AIGCC is a pan-regional member organization made up of asset managers and asset owners. We currently have over 16 members, of which there are 9 Japanese members, but also many other international investors with presence and interest on the ground here. Therefore, Japan is a key focus country for us. We also have an Asian utilities engagement program where we are currently engaging with 2 Japanese electric utility companies. We hope that today's sessions will further much needed discussion on key issues around the clean energy mix and helps place Japan within an international context. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Firstly, we have Professor Frank Giotso from the Crawford School of Public Policy of Australian National University, where he is also the Director of Centre for Climate and Energy Policy. He was a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC Assessment and Synthesis Report, and has been an advisor to the Australian government, as well as other national governments. Next, we have Kimiko Hirata, Executive Director of Climate Integrate, an independent nonprofit she founded this year. Previously, many of you would have come across her work at the Kiko Network. She was also awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2021. Last but not least, we have Professor Hiroshi Takahashi from Tsuru University. He has actively participated in Japan's policy formation in power market reform and renewables energy as an advisor to the Cabinet Office and as a member of several governmental policy councils. So swiftly passing to Professor Frank Giotso to kick us off, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be able to be with you today, and greetings from Canberra, Australia, where I live and work. Now, the organizers have asked me to provide a very short summary of the key messages that come out of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 6th assessment report, and in particular the Working Group 3 on climate change mitigation, and within that I will be focusing on energy. And so let me jump straight into it. Of course, you will know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the world's largest and most thorough scientific assessment exercise, tens of thousands of comments on the many thousands of pages of text that were prepared for this assessment exercise. The Working Group 3 report was released in April, and at this point in time represents the world's definitive synthesis and summary of the state of knowledge of everything around greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Now, the headline message from the report is both a negative one and a positive one. The negative one is the established synthesis that the world is not on track to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. The conditions under which 1.5 degrees can be achieved have been spelled out, and they're assessed as it is not obvious how they could in practice be achieved. However, and here comes the positive assessment, keeping temperature rise to 2 degrees or even below 2 degrees is eminently feasible, given tremendous technological improvements that have been made in recent years and that have led to very significant cost reductions in key technologies that are needed for decarbonization. And that is coupled with the fact that increasingly countries, national jurisdictions, subnational jurisdictions are implementing steps and policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and these policies are working successfully. So we're seeing the beginning of success. We know what needs to be done, and crucially, we know that it can be done. Just for illustration, the global emissions trajectories that would be needed for 1.5 degree outcome is the teal one here down below. in the central case, an emissions reductions of over 40% reduction from now until the year 2030. In some developed countries that will be possible, but this would need to be occurring for the world, including industrializing and developing countries, and this is not in any way realistic. When we look, however, at a 2-degree pathway, then you see the median here is about a quarter reduction in global emissions by 2030, and some of the trajectories would get away with perhaps 20% reduction at 2030 globally, and a steep reduction thereafter. And that is technologically and economically certainly feasible. The reason it's feasible is that we have tremendous amounts of reduction opportunities, mitigation opportunities right throughout the world's economy. The report, in a very detailed bottom-up assessment, shows emission reduction opportunities that would cut emissions by half, cut by 50% between now and 2030 at costs of below $100 US per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's approximately in a similar range as the European Union emissions trading price right at this moment. And about half of this overall potential, so 1/4 of global emissions reductions, would come at costs below $20 US per ton, and so eminently affordable even in the developing country context by and large. So very great promise here. And also to note that in this assessment, the energy sector in the broad accounts for the largest emission reduction potential in this analysis, as well as the largest very low cost emission reduction potential, including options that will actually not carry any economic cost because they pay for themselves over time and yield tremendous co-benefits as well. And the standout examples in the IPCC analysis, which synthesizes the world's research literature, are wind energy and solar energy as low-cost options. I already mentioned tremendous reductions in technology costs that we have, of course, seen over the last 2 decades, and this is really at the heart of the transition. These technology improvements relate not only to the provision of renewable and other clean energy, they also relate to, for example, storage technologies, batteries, of course, which enables electrification of transport. But very importantly, they also relate to alternative fuels, zero carbon fuels. And when we look at the role that hydrogen and ammonia may play in a future decarbonized world energy system, then we're beginning to see a very important set of insights here that are derived from the world's academic and applied research body of research that we have on this. And please indulge me for going into some detail as to how the IPCC discusses this in its summary statement. So ammonia and hydrogen is assessed in the following way. Advances in low carbon energy resources and carriers, such as next generation biofuels, hydrogen produced from electrolysis, synthetic fuels, and carbon neutral ammonia would substantially improve the economics of net zero energy systems. Okay, so having clean energy, in particular renewable energy, possibly also nuclear-based energy, available in molecular form, not electrons, but molecular form, is an important component of global decarbonization. And please note the emphasis in the sentence here on hydrogen produced from electrolysis. So that can be green hydrogen produced from zero carbon electricity, rather than processes that derive hydrogen from gas or coal, which are very much in the policy discussion, but certainly in the research and in the IPCC assessment are not seen as the great promise for the future. And notice the emphasis on carbon neutral ammonia. Okay. The IPCC report also points out that the characteristics of net zero energy systems will include the use of alternative energy carriers such as hydrogen, bioenergy, and ammonia to substitute for fossil fuels in sectors that are not so amenable for electrification, right? And so what is meant by that is some industrial applications, high temperature heat, some industrial processes, including steel making, for example, fertilizer production and so forth, as well as heavy transport, right? And some other application. Ammonia, if you produce hydrogen from clean energy sources at large scale, you will want to transport it. And ammonia overall is seen as a promising, cost-effective carrier for hydrogen-based energy, with some caveats around the toxicity typically of ammonia and related products, and the amount of NOx emissions that can occur in combustion. Okay. Now, allow me to finish up with a few words about finance and policy. Very importantly, the IPCC report identified an enormously large financing gap. So when we look at the amount of money that is flowing into clean energy, clean industry, and so forth, and compare it with the amount of money that would need to be invested to be on a 2-degree or below pathway, we see a gap globally of between 3 to 6 times. So we need enormous scaling up of those financing flows, especially financing flows to developing countries and in developing countries. And then finally, and I'll end on this point, assessment of the experience with policies for effective greenhouse gas mitigation. So the observation is that policies and laws to constrain emissions are rapidly increasing in number and in coverage of emissions in many, many countries. As I've already mentioned, there are many examples, in fact, an overwhelming extent of experience of successful implementation of such policies, and that practical experience has helped to improve design and implementation to also meet other goals, economic goals, social goals, distributional and equity goals, making sure, for example, that low-income earners are not disadvantaged by the implementation of emissions reduction policies. And the experience and theoretical insight also suggests that policies to reduce emissions comprehensively need to come in packages. They would ideally include economic instruments, crucially including emissions trading or carbon taxes, as well as regulatory instruments for specific objectives in particular sectors, as well as a whole basket of other policies such as subsidies for mitigation efforts, research and development support, removal of fossil fuel subsidies, and so forth. All of this needs to be adding up to a complete package. And very importantly, we also need the support of suitable institutions right across the economy that can support a holistic implementation of climate change mitigation efforts, including creating the energy industries of the future, which will include, which will feature, quite importantly, hydrogen and ammonia as clean energy carriers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very concise and to the point presentation. Maybe I'll interject with a couple of questions before passing on to our next speaker. So what really struck me was you talked about the different mitigation options and the large potential globally to cut emissions and at low cost as well. What are some of the key barriers that you see currently to us achieving, 1.5 degrees, quite unlikely now, as you said, and then 2 degrees?
Yeah, so look, the very largest barrier in the past has been cost. So most low and zero emissions technologies have been expensive, some much more expensive than the higher carbon alternatives, the traditional alternatives, and this has, of course, held up implementation. However, this is rapidly changing, and just look at the assessment by the International Energy Agency, for example, in last year's World Energy Outlook, where solar energy is recognized as the cheapest, the absolutely cheapest energy source that humanity has ever had. And it is a fact now that in many places in the world, so this is not necessarily by nation states, but in many geographies, wind or solar energy is now the cheapest way of producing energy in new installations. Okay, and this is important because the competition in practice is, of course, often between existing energy installations and new installations, and where you have the capital written off and you're only looking at short to medium term operating costs and running costs, that competition is much closer and often still ends up in favor of the fossil fuels or the higher carbon technologies. And so the replacement of existing capital stock is difficult, and not only for economic reasons, but also for political reasons and questions of regional development and social objectives. So we see that increasingly, it may be economically beneficial and certainly beneficial from a climate change perspective to close older coal-fired power stations. But this creates disruption in local communities, in regional grids, and so forth. And so the policy effort to implement greenhouse gas emissions reductions needs to be complemented by an effort to smooth the transition from the old systems to the new systems.
Yes, definitely. Just transition is something that's very close to my heart, working on the Asian utility sector. Also, just drawing back to our host country, Japan, what do you think Japan's role on climate action and financing the region should ideally be?
Well, Japan, of course, has a tremendously important role in this transition to clean energy and industrial systems in particular. I mean, Japan is recognized as as having such an important role in global leadership in new technologies and technology development, and also in broad-scale technology implementation. So bringing these top quality technologies to market and making them available to the world. Also, of course, Japan, by and large, is an exporter of capital. And so the investments that can come from Japan, including for development of new clean industries in other countries, are tremendously important. Now, in the context of new energy, clean energy carriers like hydrogen, like ammonia, we would see Japan likely as an importer of such energy in such carriers. Just as Japan is, of course, a very large energy importer now, you would expect that to continue in the future, just importing different kinds of energy. And as far as the global trade in clean ammonia and clean hydrogen goes, Japan has the potential to help shape that market and to help shape the technologies that are used in that market as a potential major customer for these products, as well as a potential likely major provider of equipment, for example, electrolyzers, industrial equipment for ammonia production, shipping equipment for these energy carriers and so forth, as well as the overall system design for these new clean energy systems. And I work at the Australian National University in Australia, and we are certainly aware that this country here, this continent, Australia, is in a tremendous situation to be a very large-scale producer of green hydrogen and of clean ammonia made on the basis of that green hydrogen, and establishing supply chains to Japan and with Japan will certainly be of great interest to this country.
Thank you. And I guess I'll note your emphasis on green hydrogen and clean ammonia as well. If anyone has any further questions for Frank, we will have any time left over. We will be doing a Q&A, so please do leave your questions in the chat. Thank you now, Frank, and we'll pass on to Kimiko for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. From here, I'd like to speak about the energy transition in Japan. Thank you for giving me some time to talk about this theme. Here, I'd like to introduce myself and also the organization I belong to, Climate Integrate. I was with the Kiko network, the IP, for 25 years, and we have been working on proposals for the investors meetings. So here I established a new organization, Climate Integrate, and so I'd like to go toward the activities for this agenda. So I'd like to continue working together with various actors and also provide opportunities for people to look into our researches. First is about the recent Japan's climate and energy policy. Last year, there was a major move was that the 2030 GHG target of 46% or maybe to 50% reduction was announced. So Japan is now heading toward this target, and there has been the revision of the basic energy plan in 2030. They will increase the percentage of RE and reduce the fossil fuel. This has been the direction. However, having said that, for coal, especially among the developed countries, the phase out has not been the conclusion here. We have not started this kind of discussion. So in 2030, the coal would explain about 19%. And then as to nuclear power, and this is a very difficult area to discuss. So as can be seen, the figure has not changed because of the difficulty of the discussion. About the renewables, certainly there has been a rise of the percentage of RE, but it is still low. As opposed to the situation in Germany, for 2030, Germany is committed to the increase of RE to 80%, but in the case of Japan, it's still low. And then in the case of hydrogen and ammonia for power sector, in Japan, there is a move to have the co-firing of hydrogen and ammonia. And this has been led by the private and public sector, and there has been a very strong move for that. But Japan is the only country that is doing this. Certainly, South Korea is said to be interested in this, but still, as a government policy, Japan is doing this. So this is the only country to do this. So there has been many issues that has been raised for the energy transition, but I'd like to speak about ammonia today, ammonia co-firing rather, since the new report has been issued here. So first and foremost, I'd like to speak about the path or how ammonia co-firing has been promoted. I'm sure many of the Japanese people are fully aware of this. First, we have to go back to the Green Innovation Strategy and the basic energy plan. And the goal for that has been 20% ammonia co-firing for coal power by 2030 and 30% hydrogen co-firing for LNG power by 2030. This has been proposed, it has been announced. And then long term, the Japan aim for 100% ammonia power and 100% hydrogen power. For that purpose, the supply chain for the ammonia is being proposed. Yes, at this moment, for the fertilizers, we have the ammonia supply chain, but not for the power. So it is the kind of fixture in which the ammonia is made from gas and brought into Japan. The size is really high, they're big, and if you take a look at the global amount of ammonia, this is 20,000 tons. Then in 2050, Japan aims for the ammonia import of 30,000. So that means that at this moment it is 1 million, and then that would reach to the 3 million. So that's the kind of the expansion Japan is aiming for. And then about ammonia, at this moment, they are all derived from fossil fuels. And then the supporting systems have been established. First is a Green Innovation Fund. Through NIDO, they have the subsidy systems. And so 7 billion yen has been allocated for fuel ammonia projects. And we have the feeling that there could be a rise for that. For the climate transition finance, within the Japan's transition finance, they have the roadmap for the power sector. So there has been the designation of ammonia co-firing, hydrogen co-firing, and biomass co-firing as the transition electricity sources. So there could be the finance provided for the ammonia, hydrogen, and biomass. So there is a signal for that. And at the same time, the government-private initiatives are moving forward. The Clean Fuel Ammonia Association is one. So large number of Japanese companies are participating in this association. Certainly, almost all the related organizations are the members. So CO2-free ammonia, the value chain is being aimed for the development. And then also inside of this country, this is not only the co-firing in Japan.
So Japan is looking to Asia at the same time, and there are many different initiatives being set up. Asia Energy Transition Initiative that was announced by the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, and this is to support development of energy transition roadmap in Asian countries. And Asian version of transition finance will be set up. And also, as a private initiative, Asia Transition Finance Study Group was set up. And probably this is at the level of idea, but Asia Zero Emission Community, this is something the government has been talking about to develop zero emission technologies. And the government of Japan would like to have standardization of such technologies across Asia. And Asia CCUS network and also bilateral supports have been provided, and the government has signed MOU with Indonesia, Thai, and Malaysia. So Japan is looking to Asia, and this includes not just ammonia, but also hydrogen and renewable energy sources as well. But at the heart of it, ammonia co-firing and co-firing technologies to be exported to the rest of Asia. That is positioned as a kind of rock solid core part of this. And there are problems here. Ammonia emission reduction capability, because ammonia is made out of fossil fuels. And I just forgot to say this, and law has been formulated in the currently held diet. And fossil fuel originating ammonia and hydrogen, the government thinks that they can be positioned as non-fossil energy sources, even if they come from fossil fuels, but then eventually they can be made out of renewable energies. Therefore, they are positioned as non-fossil energy sources. So this is kind of quite the aggressive or even violent definition of ammonia and hydrogen. There are 3 steps for CO2 emissions reduction. At the stage of production, gas mostly is the source. And in order to produce 1 ton of ammonia, 1.6 tons of CO2 emissions are emitted. Therefore, if the 1 million kilowatt coal-fire power plant and 20% ammonia coal-firing, 800,000 tons of CO2 will be emitted. So it's not CO2 free. And then the 20% ammonia coal-firing reduce only 20% of emissions for power generation, and the remaining portion will be captured through CCS technologies. But then there is no prospect for this technology to be established anytime soon. In Hokkaido, there is a demonstration, but this is less than 300,000 tons. And therefore, emission from the coal-fire power plant, that is really enormous. Therefore, to be able to capture that with the currently available technology, that is really an impossibility. And sorry, I'm not able to show you the graph, but then CO2 emissions reduction effects wise, by 2030, there's only 4% reduction with the 20% coal-firing, and even with the 50% coal-firing only for 20%, and 100% coal-firing without CCS, still there is emission. So the emission reduction potential is quite low. And then economic feasibility-wise, fuel costs are very much higher. And if 20% ammonia coal-firing, the cost will be twice as high. And then the carbon price will go up by 3 times or more. So I think this is a very much a high cost. And if you compare this with renewable energies, I think the cost increases even further and more significant. Finally, the problem of nitrogen, and this has not been very much addressed and talked about, but nitrogen is we are already disturbing the circulation of nitrogen or cycle of nitrogen. So in terms of the planetary boundary or biodiversity, already the limits have been exceeded for nitrogen. Therefore, to use nitrogen, this has a negative impact on the ecosystem and also the air pollution, oxidant pollution, as well as the soil contamination and acid rain. These can be caused. So 20% coal-firing, they explain that nitrogen is being dealt with. However, the large-scale trial or practice has never been there. And this can actually create a lot of air pollution. And we will probably need to spend a lot of money for the NOx removal equipment. So ammonia can be a problem. This is my summary. Ammonia coal-firing in thermal power sector actually prolongs lifetime of coal use after 2030, even with the 20% coal firing. And G7 is debating that by 2030, coal-fired power plants need to be phased out. That is a mainstream already among G7 countries. So ammonia is not the solution there. Because ammonia coal-firing barely contributes to CO2 reduction by 2030, without a large-scale CCS, decarbonization path of power sector, that naming often spoken about is quite unrealistic. And then technology deployment is quite uncertain. And to spend so much money for the fossil fuels, it's actually much more cost beneficial to spend that money for renewable energy sources. So public and private partnership is there to support the supply chain of ammonia for coming from fossil fuels. And they have the partnership and the subsidies, and this poses a really significant risk going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kimiko, for your detailed presentation on this very difficult subject. I think your reservation on ammonia coal-firing for the power sector in Japan is very clear. What would be the key message you have for investors engaging with utilities and the government, given that everything is so entrenched, as you described, so many initiatives are out there already? What would be your key message?
はい、最後に投資家の方に向けてというか。
So this is a message to the investors. I think this would pose the huge financial risk, and including scope 3. Information disclosure is gaining momentum at this moment. And in Japan, when we have the 20% combustion then or co-firing, this will lead to 20% reduction. However, it is not produced in Japan, so CO2 is being emitted in Australia or in Africa or other parts of the world. So this should be put into the calculation. So CO2 emission reduction should be done by 2030 with a goal. So we have to make sure that we have to make sure that whether this is the right way to go. So we have to question ourselves for that. If we are not able to do so, then it's already being developed. So once the investment is made, it is too huge, and it is very difficult to go back to the original state. So I think it is important to make a judgment relative to scope 3 in terms of the financing for that.
Thank you very much, Kimiko. And I think that's a
キミコ
really
さんありがとうございました。非常に素晴らしいお話であったと思います。高橋先生のお話につなぐという意味でも非常に良いと思っております。システム、あるいは系統、あるいは今後の状況ということについてお話をいただきます。では、高橋先生どうぞ。ありがとうございます。
私、今、大学、鶴市の大学の方におりますので、こちらから失礼いたします。今、資料を共有させていただいております。私は再生可能エネルギーの統合というテーマを与えられております。英語ではですね、再エネのインテグレーション、RE のRenewable Energyのインテグレーションというのは極めて普通の専門用語なんですけども、なかなか日本では統合っていうとですね、なんかこう悪い方の、ね、統合コストとかっていうふうに使われることがあります。私が今日申し上げたいのは、電力システムをですね、変えると、改革をすることが必要であると。それがさえすれば、再生可能エネルギーは大量に入りますよということです。もう皆さんご存知の通り、今、最も伸びている電源は、この左の方にあるですね、再生可能エネルギーであると。こちらは電源構成、ミックスの伸びですね、を表している数値ですけれども、特に欧州諸国がですね、ものすごい勢いで再生可能エネルギーの率を伸ばしていると。それから中国ですね、この青い線ですね、中国もかなりの勢い、あれだけの国土ですから、電力消費も日本の5倍ぐらいあるにもかかわらず、これだけ伸ばしていると。で、日本はこの赤のところでですね、フィットが入ってからは、それなりには伸びていますけれども、このドイツとかですね、イギリスとかの伸びと比べればもう完全に遅れてしまっているという状況にあります。で、今日のテーマではありませんが、右の方が原子力ということで、軒並み、減らしていっているという状況にあるわけです。じゃあ、再エネを導入するためにどういうことが必要かと言われると、大きく4つポイントがあると思っております。コスト、これが高い高いとずっと言われてきましたが、先ほどちょっと教授、先生からもあった通りですね、もう今や最も安い電源、風力太陽光はなっているということです。それから、この左下のところでですね、社会的あるいは環境的な制約、これ、今最近日本でもかなり指摘されるようになってきましてですね、私はこれが今後ですね、非常に重要な問題になってくると思っています。地域住民からの反対とかですね、そういうサステイナブルな形でですね、導入をしていく必要があると。で、今日のポイント、私の話はですね、この右側の2つの話で、既存のシステムですね、ここを変えることによって、原子力、再生可能エネルギーはですね、容易にコストも安く入っていきますよということで、還元すれば既存のシステムが邪魔をしているから、なかなか日本では入っていかないと。で大きく分けると、送電網、電力システム、フィジカルなコンストレイントとですね、マーケット、市場で電力っていうのは取引をされますから、市場側の制約と大きく2つにポイントが分かれるんではないかと。なぜかというとですね、こちら、左側、既存の仕組みというのはですね、再エネが入るような、入りやすい仕組みになっていないということでありまして、例えば原子力とか石炭火力のような大型の集中電源を基本にしていると。で集中電源、大規模電源というのはやはり大きな企業しか投資ができないと。いうことがまずあると。でそれから独占を基本としてきました。で発送電一貫で長らく日本だけじゃなくですね、世界中でやってきたということですから、送電網を他人に貸すという発想がそもそもなかった。このような集中型のシステムに対して、やはり送電網をなかなか使えないとかですね、市場で売りたくても自由に売れないといったようなさまざまな問題が生じてきていると。で、それは欧州諸国も同じだったわけですけれども、90年代に大体自由化をして、2000年代以降、このような問題を一つ一つ解決をしてきたから、先ほど示したようにですね、大量の再エネが入り、もう普通の電源になってしまっているという状況です。ですので、この後ですね、3つぐらい大きなポイントを具体例を示してですね、こういう点で解決が必要なんですよというお話をしたいと思っています。まず一つがグリッドアクセス、系統接続ですね。あらゆる電源が送電網につながらなければ、当然、大量にですね、ビジネスができないといいますか、いくら発電所を作っても活用できないということです。しかしながら、私もつい先日ですね、とある村に視察に行ってきたんですけれども、水力発電所を建設しようと思ってですね、地域の送電会社、電力会社に尋ねたら、接続費用15兆円必要で、15億円必要ですと言われたとおっしゃっていました。 日本は基本的にはですね、接続をする際に、既存の送電網を増強しないといけないということで、増強費用が求められると。それがもう何億円、15億円といったような話になりますから、再エネというのは規模が一つ一つが小さいですので、いきなりその15億円払ってくださいと言われても、これは払えないという話になっていると。で、海外ではどうなっているかというと、国によっても違うんですが、ここコネクト&マネージと書いてありますけれども、まずはつなぎましょうと。で、つないだ上でですね、混雑が生じないようにうまくマネージしていきましょうというようなことを、例えばイギリスなんかではこうやっていますけれども、なかなか日本でそのような柔軟な仕組みというものが取り入れられてこなかったと。しかしながらですね、東京電力さんですね、東京電力とパワーグリッドさんが、2019年にですね、そういう提案をして、これはいいことだということで、日本全国にですね、展開されるようになってきました。何もしてないというわけではないんですけれども、まだ今、上位の系統の方しか今適用されていなくてですね、いわゆるローカルグリッドの方にはこれからであるということですから、再エネの多くはローカルグリッドの方に接続されますので、なかなかまだこの効果が出ていないという状況にありま
This
す。
has not been effective enough for renewables. And then also,
増強しないといけないということで、今、オクト電力広域的運営推進機関でマスタープランというものを作っていて、それも非常にいいことなわけですけれども、非常に時間がかかっているということと、その送電網の建設の負担方法についてもですね、ちょっとまだ議論があって、進んでいないというような状況にあります。送電網が自由に使えると、もちろん接続最低限のですね、自衛線の費用とか送電料金は払うわけですけれども、新規参入のですね、送電事業者、再エネ事業者が送電網を自由に使えるようにするというのは最低限必要なことであろうということです。で、次は出力抑制。接続されたらどんどん発電できるわけですけれども、その再エネ電力が抑制されてしまうということが今、日本各地で起きていると。で、出力抑制自体はですね、合理的な範囲であれば、当然必要なことですし、欧州でも普通には行われていることなわけですけれども、日本はなかなかそこまで合理的ではないと。例えば、18年以来、九州の方で先行して、再エネ電力が捨てられてきたわけですけれども、この背景にありますのがですね、やはり原子力なんですね。九州は最も早く原子力が再稼働している地域ですので、原子力は出力抑制されませんので、まず原子力を入れてから、その上に再エネが乗っかってくるということですので、原子力がたくさん入れば入るほど、再エネの出力抑制が大きくなるということなわけです。こちらのグラフを見ていただきたいんですけれども、2018年から九州で出力抑制が始まりまして、日数ですね、それがこちらの折れ線グラフですね、年間の回数、日数がこちらのグラフでありまして、当然、それかけるその日に出力抑制されたキロワットを足し合わせたのがこのオレンジのグラフなわけですけれども、当然増えてきているということです。ただ、これ注目していただきたいのは、再エネの容量、緑のところはですね、順調にといいますか、1ギガワットずつぐらい増えてきているわけですけれども、原子力の発電電力量ですね、を見ると、2020年はですね、原子力発電所が止まっていたので少なかったんですね。そうすると、こちら、出力抑制の量も減っていると。で、また今、再稼働してきてますから、2021年度は増えているという状況にあります。で、他の地域がですね、これまで出力抑制がなかったのも、原子力の再稼働が順調に進んでいなかったからということですので、やはりその原子力を止めずに、再エネを止めるという、これは給電順位の問題なんですけれども、やはりそういうことをちゃんと解決しなければですね、こういう問題が生じてですね、今もう他の地域にも今年の4月から拡大してきていますので、やはりこれ早く保証をするとかですね、そういう対策を取っていかないといけない、あるいは送電網の建設が求められるということだと考えております。3つ目がやはり市場の問題でありまして、再エネを売り物にする小売事業者とかですね、新電力とかたくさん入ってきているわけですけれども、ホールセールマーケットですね、発電市場、卸市場でもですね、小売市場でもいまだに8割、既存の大手電力会社が占有しているという状況で、なかなか十分な競争が生じていない にもかかわらずですね、容量市場と言いまして、老朽火力とかに対してファイナンスをするといったような、逆行するような仕組みが導入されていたりだとか、あるいは非化石市場ですね、ノンフォシルサーティフィケートって、これなかなか海外では理解されない言葉だと思うんですけども、再エネ証書ではなくてですね、非化石であれば別にいいじゃないかと、原子力もいいじゃないかといったような証書が日本では流通しているですとか、そういうなかなか再エネを訴求しづらいような仕組みが残されていますと。で、その結果、1年前にですね、いわゆるスポット価格高騰問題というのも起きておりまして、なかなか市場をちゃんと整備しないと解決していかないんじゃないかと、再エネが進まないんじゃないかということが懸念されているわけです。で、再エネが優先順位が低いと、いろんな意味で優先順位が低いということは、先ほど平田さんの方からもありましたけれども、日本の電源ミックスの目標値にも表れておりまして、こちらですね、見ていただきたいんですけども、こちらですね、こちらが2030年の電源ミックスの目標値なわけですけれども、原子力も結構残していますし、石炭ですね、もかなり残しているという状況であります。さらに2050年、これは参考値ということで、資源エネ庁よりもから示されたわけですけども、再エネは50から60%であって、それ以外がゼロエミッション電源ということになるわけですが、ゼロエミッション電源がですね、CCS 火力とか水素、アンモニアを含めてですね、4、50%残るということであります。で、この一番右側が IEA のネットゼロ by 2050なわけですが、こちらは再エネが 88%、これ世界全体ですけれども、世界全体で再エネが 88% で、原子力が 8%、CCS 火力が 2%、水素火力が 2% ということですから、いかに日本がですね、原子力やゼロエミッション火力に期待をしているのかということが分かるんではないかと思うわけです。で、そういう、先ほど平田さんの話と重なりますけども、非常にゼロエミッション火力に期待をしている、岸田首相がですね、昨年の COP で、いわゆるフォシル・オブ・ザ・デイ・アワードですね、化石受賞したというのは非常に象徴的な出来事だったんではないかというふうに思っております。ということで、まとめですけれども、やはり独占をベースとしてですね、大規模な火力とか原子力に、柱としてきたですね、中中型のシステム、これをトランジションするんだというのが、今必要であります。この第3象限から第1象限の方に移していくというのが、トランジションの肝なわけでして、実際ですね、欧州諸国とかは基本的には、この第1象限を目指していると、第3から第1の方に移ろうとしているという中で、日本はまだまだこの第3象限にいようと頑張っているという状況です。これをいかに競争ベースで再エネベースの仕組みに移していくのかということが鍵だということで、私のお話を終えさせていただきます。どうもご清聴ありがとうございました。